Hello and welcome to another video. My name is Adana and today we are going to be painting a stylized spread of oranges and mandarins using gouache. I have created actually quite a few gouache paintings in my sketchbook over the past year, and I've been testing and trying various techniques. Some of those techniques have worked out really well and others not so much. So as I'm painting this spread, I also wanted to share some of the mistakes that beginner artists tend to make when using gouache paint that I certainly made when I was first learning how to use this medium. Gouache is a fantastic and versatile medium, but beginner artists like myself, when I first started, often run into challenges because it behaves so differently from watercolor or acrylic or any other mediums. So here are some common mistakes that beginners make when using gouache and how to avoid them. Before we get into those mistakes and how to avoid them, I did want to note that gouache does come in two forms. Traditional gouache that can be reworked after it has dried, or acrylic gouache that behaves more like acrylic. Once acrylic gouache dries, it can't be reworked with water. So as I'm talking about things like rewetting capabilities and potential issues with that, just note that these tips are more so geared towards traditional gouache, although with acrylic gouache, there can be some similarities when it comes to like opacity issues and things like that. But for the most part, anything talking about rewetting, I'm really keeping in mind that I'm talking about traditional gouache. So one of the first mistakes that I made when it came to gouache is making sure that I get the right consistency. And with gouache, sometimes you can be using too much or too little water. So you really have to understand and control that water to paint ratio. If you use too much water, then that makes gouache act more like watercolor. So it can get very transparent. Depending on the pigment that you're using and the quality of the paint, it can be very streaky. If you're using too little water, the paint can become very thick, very chalky, and also very streaky. So it just depends on how you're using the paint and how you want to paint. I will admit I do sometimes tend to use too much water rather than too little water, and sometimes that's intentional. Sometimes I do want to have more of a watercolor wash, but just know that if you're trying to use gouache in a traditional manner, you have to really control that water to paint ratio. So I would say aim for a creamy or milk-like consistency for general use. You definitely want to practice with swatches to kind of get a feel for the right balance. Another mistake that I made early on was really overworking the paper. So this is something that I think all artists kind of struggle with. Overworking the paper is definitely a big mistake that I made, and I think I see other artists making, especially when it comes to like repeatedly adding water and potentially brushing over the same area. So if you made a mistake in one area, then you go in and add more paint or more water to your brush and try to brush back over to kind of fix it. And traditional gouache does reactivate with water, so every time you go over a layer, most times it can lift the previous one, leading to muddiness or tearing the paper, especially if you don't have that water to paint ratio down pat. In order to avoid overworking the paper and having that muddiness or tearing of the paper, you have to let the layers dry completely. And then if you want to use any technique like glazing techniques or things like that, definitely use a light touch and be very mindful of the water that you're using for that glaze. To that same end, another mistake that I see many beginner artists making is using the wrong paper. So painting on like overly thin or overly smooth paper is kind of a recipe for disaster with gouache. Gouache is a very heavy medium. It can, warp thin paper. It can also be really tricky when it comes to trying to adhere to really slick surfaces. So avoid like very smooth vellum paper, avoid copier paper. I would even avoid very thin sketch or drawing paper because I just don't think that gouache works well with those types of papers. It often doesn't have like a good outcome. Now, I don't think that you necessarily need to use watercolor paper. Watercolor paper is like probably the best paper for very heavy water-used mediums. I don't think you need to use watercolor paper, but you do ideally want to use something that is a bit thicker, that has like 200 to 300 GSM weight and has a little bit of texture to it. So something like watercolor paper obviously can work well, but you can also use like a very good thick like cardstock or a mixed media paper. I often am using mixed media paper when it comes to gouache. That works really well for me, and I think that it's kind of like a happy medium. You don't want to spend a bunch of money on watercolor paper for something that you're not going to use watercolor on. So then just think about making sure that you use the right type of paper and something that's just a little bit thicker that can handle the weight of the paint. When I first learned to paint, I learned using oil paint. And with oil paint, you know, for the most part, unless you had like a very thin, depending on the pigment or if you use too much medium, for the most part, you can kind of expect one pass to cover whatever it is that you're trying to cover. You can't really expect the same thing for gouache. Gouache doesn't necessarily always cover everything in one pass. Some pigments or some colors are naturally just more transparent and just require more layering. So you just have to keep that in mind. You're going to have to build up the layers. You have to use gouache to build up the layers to get to the desired effect that you want. For the most part, I think with acrylic gouache, you can kind of get some capacity. There is a little bit of a better opacity with acrylic gouache than with traditional gouache, but if you do want to use traditional gouache, which that's what I typically use, you can use white gouache to increase the opacity when needed and apply light over dark for best coverage. Another mistake that I made very early on, and you can see many examples of this on my channel that's related to the previous one, is not understanding the color shifts in gouache. For whatever reason, darker colors in gouache tend to dry lighter and lighter colors tend to dry darker. So as you were learning how to use gouache, I would definitely encourage you to swatch as much as possible. Have like a little piece of paper on the side that you can, as you mix a color, you can kind of test it, let it dry a little bit and see how, if that's the color that you're looking for, if that's the right value that you're looking for. That has definitely been something that really irked me a lot when I was first learning how to make gouache or how to use gouache, and it led to a lot of failed paintings in the beginning. But now that I know this quality about gouache, I definitely encourage folks to, until you learn what colors are going to dry differently or how they're going to dry differently, definitely have like a swatch pad or something on the side to swatch and test and make sure that that's the color that you actually want before putting that on your painting. Another mistake that I, again, have made many times is not mixing enough paint. When I first was starting out, for some reason I was very stingy with my paint. Art supplies are very expensive, so I was a little bit like, I'm just gonna take a little dab of that, make my color, and then, put it on my painting. But then I would realize, wait, I didn't have enough color. So I'm mixing all these like little tiny custom colors. It is hard to get a certain opacity, just kind of be aware of the color shifts that happen. Again, gouache does shift colors as it dries depending on the color. So you are running into a problem when you don't mix enough paint to cover the area that you're going to cover. So you end up running out midway, and then you'll end up struggling to remix the same exact color match, which is something I've done many times. So as with all of your mediums, definitely don't think about wasting it. Mix a little bit more than you need. If you do mix too much, you can always store leftovers in airtight palettes or containers. I've done that, several times. I've mixed a certain color and I'm like, oh, I really like that. And then I'll go in and mix more of it because I know I'm going to probably use it in another painting in the future. So you never want to get to a point where like you don't have enough paint mixed together, and that can cause like little shifts in your painting. Now that could be something that you're like going for, that like variety, but if you want to have a consistency, definitely mix more paint than you think you'll need, and you can always store it for reuse later. All right, so those are all of the mistakes that I noticed I have made when first learning to use gouache, and some, things that I've seen or noticed that others have made as well. What do you think? Have you used gouache before? Definitely let me know what are some tips or recommendations that you have that you think a beginner painter that's learning gouache should know before they use this medium. I'm curious to know if I struggled with the same things or if there's some other things that I have left off this list that you think that someone should know. But either way, thank you so much for watching. If you liked this video, definitely give it a thumbs up, as well as subscribe if you have not already and you want to see more videos like this. But thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!